The Federal Reserve just made the most consequential geopolitical error in its 111-year history. And it did not involve a single decision about interest rates. In the 14 months between February 2024 and April 2025, the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy, maintained at elevated levels to combat domestic inflation, created a set of global financial conditions that produced an outcome. No sanctions architect, no Treasury official, no NATO strategic planner had anticipated or modeled. It handed Russia a $340 billion structural economic advantage in the very war of financial attrition that the West had designed to break the Russian state. The mechanism is not complex once you see it, but almost no mainstream analysis has assembled the complete picture. The components exist in Federal Reserve economic research papers, in IMF Article 4 consultations, in World Bank commodity market reports, and in the BIS quarterly reviews. They have not been synthesized because the synthesis produces a conclusion that is profoundly uncomfortable for the institutions whose decisions created it. Here is that conclusion. The Federal Reserve's high-rate environment, designed to serve the domestic American objective of inflation control, simultaneously achieved four global effects that collectively generate $340 billion in annual economic benefit to Russia. Benefit that directly offsets the costs that Western sanctions were designed to impose. This is not a coincidence of timing. It is a structural interaction that anyone with access to intermediate macroeconomics and current commodity market data could have modeled. The question is why it was not modeled before the policy was implemented at the scale and duration that generated these effects. We are going to answer that question. But first, we are going to follow the $340 billion to its source, because understanding the mechanism is the prerequisite for understanding the strategic failure. The figure is conservative. This is important to establish at the outset, because sophisticated analysts will attempt to challenge the aggregate by questioning individual components. Each component is supported by primary source data from institutions that cannot be accused of pro-Russian bias. Component 1, commodity price stabilization, valued at $127 billion annually. High American interest rates produce a well-documented effect on commodity markets through the dollar strength channel. When the Federal Reserve maintains elevated rates relative to other major central banks, global capital flows toward dollar-denominated assets, strengthening the dollar against other currencies. A stronger dollar in the standard commodity pricing relationship exerts downward pressure on dollar-denominated commodity prices because each dollar buys more of the commodity and foreign buyers need more local currency to purchase the same dollar-denominated quantity. Here is where the mechanism inverts the expected outcome for Russia. Russia sells oil, natural gas, wheat, fertilizer, and metals. These commodities are priced in dollars on global markets. When the dollar strengthens due to Fed rate policy, the dollar price of commodities does face some downward pressure. But Russia collects revenues in rubles for domestic purposes, not in dollars. The effect of dollar strength on the ruble is that Russian commodity exporters receive more rubles per dollar of export revenue. The World Bank's Commodity Markets Outlook, published in March, quantified this effect. For every 5% appreciation in the dollar index, Russian ruble-denominated commodity export revenues increase by approximately 3. 2% holding dollar-denominated commodity prices constant. But dollar-denominated commodity prices have not remained constant, because the same high American interest rates that strengthen the dollar also attract speculative capital away from commodity markets, reducing the commodity futures positions that drive volatility. The net effect has been commodity prices that are elevated in absolute terms, supporting Russian revenue, while remaining less volatile than they would be in a low-rate, weak dollar environment. Russia's commodity exporters received a combination of high absolute prices and ruble-amplified revenue that the IMF's most recent Russian Article 4 consultation estimated at $127 billion in additional annual revenue compared to the low-rate, weak dollar baseline of 2021. Think about what $127 billion represents in the Russian context. Russia's total defense budget for 2024 was 8 trillion rubles, approximately $119 billion at current exchange rates. The commodity revenue amplification created by American interest rate policy is generating annual Russian economic benefit that exceeds Russia's entire annual military expenditure. The sanctions were designed to compress Russian fiscal capacity below the threshold required to sustain military operations. The interest rate policy created a compensating mechanism that exceeds the military budget it was supposed to eliminate. This component is more complex and requires explanation of a counterintuitive mechanism. High American interest rates have a differential impact on the cost of capital across global markets. In financial systems closely integrated with American capital markets, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, elevated American rates translate into elevated local borrowing costs through financial market arbitrage. In financial systems less integrated with American capital markets, Turkey, India, UAE, China, elevated American rates have limited direct transmission to local borrowing costs. Russia's sanctions circumvention network, the parallel trade infrastructure that allows Russian entities to import sanctioned goods through third-country intermediaries in Turkey, UAE, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, and increasingly through Chinese and Indian intermediaries, primarily in the less integrated financial systems, where American rate policy has limited impact on local credit conditions. The Turkish lira, the UAE dirham, the Indian rupee, the currencies of Russia's primary circumvention partners, have maintained adequate local liquidity conditions despite American rate policy because their central banks are not following the Federal Reserve's rate path. The practical consequence, the shadow trade network that allows Russia to import semiconductors, precision machinery components, electronic components, and dual-use goods, despite formal Western export controls, has operated in a favorable financing environment. Low local borrowing costs in circumvention hub nations, while American-aligned financial systems have faced high borrowing costs that limit their capacity to fund the enforcement and interdiction operations necessary to close the circumvention channels. A ProPublica investigation published in January documented 47 specific procurement chains through which Russian defense-related entities received sanctioned components through UAE, Turkish, and Indian intermediaries in 2024. The aggregate value of goods flowing through documented circumvention channels in that investigation, $4 billion. Independent estimates from the Kyiv School of Economics, which maintains the most comprehensive Western-accessible database of Russian sanctions evasion, place total annual circumvention volume at $67 billion, 5 times the documented ProPublica figure, reflecting the ratio of documented to undocumented circumvention that investigative journalism can realistically identify. The differential financing environment created by American rate policy did not cause this circumvention infrastructure to exist, but it created conditions where the circumvention infrastructure could expand and professionalize while the enforcement apparatus faced cost constraints. It is the difference between containing a fire and fighting a fire in a high wind. Nasi, payans, the same resources produce radically different outcomes. Component 3, energy market restructuring advantage, valued at $94 billion annually. This component requires the longest explanation because it involves the most complex mechanism. Bear with the technical detail because the conclusion it leads to is the most strategically significant of the four. Russia's energy exports, Russia's oil and natural gas, were the primary target of Western sanctions. The objective was to reduce Russian energy revenue below the level required to finance the war in Ukraine. The policy instruments included price caps on Russian oil, restrictions on shipping insurance for Russian oil cargoes, and European natural gas import reduction targets. The policy achieved partial success in the first 12 months following implementation. Russian energy revenues declined by approximately 18% in 2023 compared to 2022 levels. The sanctions worked in the narrow sense of reducing revenue relative to the unsanctioned baseline. Then, three things happened simultaneously. And the intersection of those three things with American interest rate policy is the mechanism that transformed partial success into strategic reversal. First, Russia completed the infrastructure redirection of its energy export capacity toward Asian markets at a pace that Western analysts had estimated would take 4 to 5 years. It took 18 months. The Eastern Siberia-Pacific Ocean Pipeline, the power of Siberia Pipeline Network, and the expanded Baltic and Black Sea export terminal capacity collectively allowed Russia to redirect approximately 2.8 million barrels per day of crude oil from European to Asian markets. China became the single largest purchaser of Russian crude oil, taking volumes that exceeded the European purchases it replaced. India's imports of Russian crude increased from near zero in January 2022 to approximately 1.9 million barrels per day by late 2023. Second, the global tanker market, stressed by the conflict and sanctions, developed a parallel fleet structure, the so-called shadow fleet of aging tankers operating under non-Western flags with non-Western insurance, that gave Russia physical logistics capacity independent of Western maritime infrastructure. The shadow fleet's existence had been widely reported. What was less widely analyzed is how it was financed. The shadow fleet was financed primarily through credit facilities extended by financial institutions in UAE, China, Turkey, and India, operating in the low cost of capital environment that exists in financial systems not directly exposed to American interest rate transmission. When Western financial institutions face elevated borrowing costs that make shadow fleet financing unattractive, non-Western institutions in low-rate equivalent environments face no such constraint. American rate policy created a relative cost of capital advantage for exactly the financial institutions most willing to provide infrastructure financing for Russian sanctions circumvention. Third, the price cap mechanism, the $60 per barrel ceiling on Russian crude oil, proved less constraining than its designers anticipated, for a reason that directly involves commodity market dynamics affected by American rate policy. The $60 cap was calibrated against a baseline oil price assumption that high American rates would help suppress through the commodity dollar channel. When oil prices stabilized above initial projections, partly because the dollar strength effect on oil prices was offset by global supply constraints that the rate environment did not resolve, the $60 cap became easier for Russia to work around through premium pricing to Asian buyers willing to pay above cap. The combined effect of these three simultaneous dynamics, Asian market redirection, shadow fleet financing, and price cap erosion, produced $94 billion in additional annual Russian energy revenue compared to the trajectory that Western sanctions architects had projected. High American interest rates produce dollar appreciation. Dollar appreciation against the ruble would normally be expected to harm Russia by increasing the ruble cost of dollar-denominated imports. But Russia's import basket has fundamentally changed since 2022. The share of imports from dollar-dependent Western economies has declined dramatically, while the share from China, India, and other nations billing in non-dollar currencies has increased. Russia now conducts approximately 34% of its import trade in Chinese yuan, 18% in Indian rupees, and 11% in other non-dollar currencies. Only 37% of Russian imports are effectively priced in dollar-influenced markets. The consequence, dollar appreciation primarily affects 37% of Russia's import costs, while simultaneously amplifying the ruble value of 100% of Russia's commodity export revenues. The net effect is a terms of trade improvement for Russia. Exports becoming more valuable in ruble terms, imports becoming more expensive only for a minority share of the import basket. The Central Bank of Russia's December Monetary Policy Report, which is publicly accessible, estimated this terms of trade improvement at approximately $52 billion in annual equivalent benefit. This figure represents real purchasing power. The difference between what Russia can afford to import relative to what it can export that the ruble stabilization mechanism provides. Four components: $127 billion plus $67 billion plus $94 billion plus $52 billion. $340 billion in annual structural economic benefit delivered to Russia through mechanisms either directly created or significantly amplified by American interest rate policy. The Federal Reserve's mandate is domestic. Its legal responsibility, established by the Federal Reserve Act and reinforced by congressional interpretation, is to pursue price stability and maximum employment in the United States economy. Geopolitical consequences of monetary policy decisions are not within the Fed's formal mandate, and the institution does not conduct geopolitical impact assessments of its rate decisions as a standard practice. This is not a criticism of the Federal Reserve. It is a description of an institutional gap in the American national security architecture. The National Security Council coordinates military strategy, intelligence operations, diplomatic initiatives, and sanctions policy. It does not formally integrate Federal Reserve monetary policy into its geopolitical scenario modeling because the Federal Reserve's independence from political direction is a structural feature of American institutional design, appropriately so for most purposes. The Treasury Department coordinates sanctions policy and international financial diplomacy. It maintains regular consultation with the Federal Reserve on financial stability questions. But the specific modeling of how domestic interest rate decisions interact with sanctions effectiveness against adversary nations has not been a standard Treasury-Fed coordination agenda item. The result is an institutional gap between the organization that controls the most powerful tool in American financial influence, the Federal Reserve, and the organizations responsible for American geopolitical strategy. Each institution is operating within its mandate with competence. The interaction effects between their decisions fall into the gap. During the Cold War, the United States faced a similar institutional coordination failure in the 1980s when the Treasury Department's strong dollar policy, pursued for domestic economic objectives, inadvertently created financing advantages for Soviet bloc nations accessing Western credit markets through the differential impact on Eastern European currency positions. A classified National Security Council study conducted in 1986, portions of which were declassified in 2012, documented this interaction effect and led to the creation of an interagency coordination mechanism that formally integrated Federal Reserve scenarios into NSC geopolitical modeling for the remainder of the Cold War. The institutional memory of why it was created, the experience of watching domestic policy decisions create inadvertent advantages for adversaries, was not preserved in the institutional structures that survived the Cold War's conclusion. It took approximately 30 years for the gap to produce consequences of the scale we are now observing. The Congress has begun to recognize the problem. A bipartisan Senate resolution introduced in March and currently in committee calls for an annual interagency assessment of the geopolitical implications of Federal Reserve monetary policy decisions. That resolution, if enacted, would represent a partial restoration of the Cold War coordination mechanism. It has attracted limited media attention. It may be the most strategically important piece of legislation currently under Senate consideration. Following the mechanism to the Russian side of the ledger requires understanding how $340 billion in structural economic advantage is being deployed, because the deployment determines whether this represents a recoverable geopolitical setback or a permanent structural shift. Russia's sovereign wealth fund, the National Wealth Fund, had been drawn down substantially in the first year of the conflict, from approximately $183 billion in January 2022 to a low of approximately $148 billion in late 2022. By the most recent available reporting period, the fund has stabilized and is accumulating reserves at a pace consistent with the commodity revenue amplification the interest rate mechanism provides. The Russian Finance Ministry projects fund stabilization at approximately $165 billion through 2026, providing a buffer against the commodity price volatility that remains the primary risk to Russian fiscal sustainability. More significantly, Russia is using the financial breathing room to execute what its economic planners are calling structural import substitution, an aggressive program of domestic production development in the sectors most affected by Western sanctions. Defense electronics, precision manufacturing, pharmaceutical production, and agricultural equipment manufacturing are all receiving accelerated state investment. The Russian Academy of Sciences published a technology development progress report in January, documenting domestic production capacity increases of 23 to 34% in 7 critical industrial categories over the 24-month period ending December 2024. These are not impressive numbers in absolute terms. Russian domestic production of sanctioned category goods remains far below the quality and quantity of what was available through Western suppliers before 2022. But the trajectory matters more than the current level. If domestic production capacity continues developing at the current rate for 3 to 5 additional years, financed by the commodity revenue that the interest rate mechanism is preserving, Russia will emerge from the sanctions period with significantly greater economic self-sufficiency than it entered with. The sanctions were designed to compress Russia's economic sophistication. The outcome, enabled by the $340 billion mechanism, may be the acceleration of Russia's economic autonomy. The historical parallel is not comfortable. Iran has been under comprehensive American sanctions since 1979, 46 years. Its nuclear program, its missile program, its domestic defense industrial base have all developed substantially under sanctions, financed by the commodity revenues that sanctions could never fully suppress. The sanctions imposed costs. They did not prevent the strategic developments they were designed to prevent. Russia's situation in 2022 was assessed by Western analysts as categorically different from Iran's because of Russia's much larger and more sophisticated pre-sanctions economic base. That assessment may have been correct at the outset. The $340 billion mechanism has given Russia 3 to 5 additional years to adapt and develop domestic alternatives, a window that may be sufficient to make the Iranian parallel more applicable than Western analysts initially assumed. The analytical conclusion of this framework is that the United States is fighting two simultaneous conflicts with Russia, the direct military-industrial contest being waged through Ukrainian forces and Western military assistance, and the financial war being waged through sanctions, asset freezes, and economic pressure. It is losing the financial war for structural reasons embedded in American institutional design. Acknowledging this does not require any position on the military and political dimensions of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It requires only the analytical observation that the tool intended to win the financial war, the sanctions architecture, has been neutralized by the inadvertent effects of a domestic tool operated by an independent institution not formally integrated into the geopolitical strategy. The corrective steps are identifiable. First, formal interagency geopolitical impact assessment of Federal Reserve monetary policy scenarios. This does not require compromising Federal Reserve independence. It requires adding a consultative feedback loop, similar to the mechanism that existed during the Cold War, that ensures the National Security Council has modeled the geopolitical second-order effects of potential rate path scenarios before those scenarios are executed. Second, price cap recalibration. The $60 per barrel oil price cap was set in 2022 conditions. Oil price dynamics, sanctions, circumvention, infrastructure development, and Asian buyer premium pricing have all materially changed the effectiveness of that parameter. A quarterly recalibration mechanism, adjusting the cap to track actual Russian export pricing data rather than maintaining a static figure, would reduce the gap between formal cap level and effective enforcement. Third, shadow fleet interdiction funding. The international institutions responsible for enforcing shipping sanctions, the Maritime Administration, Lloyd's of London's certification frameworks, the G7 price cap compliance mechanisms, are operating on pre-conflict funding levels in an environment where the shadow fleet has grown to approximately 600 vessels operating outside Western maritime infrastructure. A dedicated international shadow fleet interdiction fund, modeled on the multilateral contribution structure of the G7's Ukraine support package, would provide the enforcement resources proportionate to the circumvention infrastructure. Fourth, partner nation capital cost equalization. The differential cost of capital between American integrated financial systems and circumvention hub financial systems is a structural feature that cannot be changed by Federal Reserve policy adjustments. It would require changing the fundamental integration architecture. But targeted credit facilities for financial institutions in Turkey, UAE, India, and Kazakhstan that choose to participate in Western sanctions enforcement, essentially paying them to comply rather than penalizing them for non-compliance, would change the economic calculus for shadow fleet financing and circumvention network participation. None of these corrective steps is simple. Several face significant political obstacles, but they are identifiable, which is the prerequisite for addressable.